Could you explain all the problems in French-Algerian relations through the prism of soccer? Could you even solve all these problems through soccer? Stay tuned as we explore the history of French-Algerian relations ever since the Algerian War of Independence in 1954 to 1962. In part 1 of this video, we studied the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. I won't go over every detail, again, just watch the video, but long story short, this was a dirty war, where the FLN, the Algerian Movement for Independence, employed such methods as guerrilla warfare and even terrorism in an attempt to kick the French out. In response, the French army would use some techniques that would include torture. And so in 1962, when Algeria did become independent from France, there was much bitterness still outstanding. In many ways, this was not just a war, this was a civil war. Within France, the French president, Charles de Gaulle, was seen by many French people as being a traitor because he had pulled out of the country. So you have a number of people who tried attacks against him, including assassination attacks, and at some point the French army even was in open revolt against him and tried a military coup d'etat. If you shift to Algeria, you have a similar situation where a number of people were in favor of independence, but others, such as the Pieds Noirs, the French settlers in Algeria, who did not want to be independent, or the Harkis, who would be Muslim supporters of France. And those two groups, the Harkis and the Pieds Noirs, were either killed or forced out of Algeria at the moment of independence. So how do you recover from that? In the 1960s, the situation was smoothed over a bit, at least in France, by the fact that economic growth was pretty good. So, when your pocketbook is full, typically you don't complain as much, even when you're French. Algeria had a more complicated situation. When Algeria became independent, there was a hope that, freed from the shackles of French imperialism, Algeria would take off economically. And right around the time of independence, large reserves of oil and natural gas were found in the Algerian desert. So you would have all the recipe for economic development there. In practice, though, in part due to mismanagement of the economy, in part due to the fact that you have a huge growth rate of the population in Algeria, there was not enough economic growth to make the whole population employed and rich. So nowadays, even something like 50 years after independence, France still has a GDP per capita that is much higher than that of Algeria. What happens in that case is that there's a lot of pressure from the poor country to maybe emigrate to richer countries. And we've seen that not just between Algeria and France, but that's true between Mexico and the US, and Turkey and Germany, and Pakistan and Britain, and on and on and on. So you had quite a few Algerian immigrants that came to France to work in things like construction, household work, the automobile industry. And initially in the 60s, there were plenty of jobs in France, so that was not as much of an issue. Though you might have some Pieds Noirs, some of these French settlers from Algeria that have been kicked out to France, who might complain. If they live in a public housing project in Marseille, in the south of France, and then a family of Algerian immigrants moves in next door, you could see how the relationship between the two groups might be tense, because the Pieds Noirs would complain, wait a minute, you kicked me out of Algeria, and now that you have a country of your own, you move to France to steal my job. Usually you have a lot of tensions related to immigration in the world. If you combine that with the Algerian War of Independence, which had been bitter by itself, you have some kind of an explosive compound. The 1970s would add some even greater fire into the mix because the economy of France went downhill. In 1973, linked to the Yom Kippur War in Israel, the price of oil in the Middle East doubled, and then doubled again in 1979 because of another event in the Middle East, and that would be the Iranian Revolution of '79. And in fact, I have two videos planned, one on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and one on the fall of the Shah of Iran, so you get the whole story there. The consequence for France is just that oil, the prices went through the roof, inflation followed, and then full employment came to an end. Similar crisis that you had in the US also in the 70s, with the difference that the US economy eventually rebounded, whereas the French economy has been in a slump kind of ever since, with high unemployment, usually above 10%, and low economic growth. France is not a poor country, but it's one that's just barely kind of struggling along year to year. And that had some problems internally within the French society, because now all the immigrants who came from Algeria and elsewhere, they could not find jobs as easily as before. and areas in France where many of these immigrants lived. And these are called the banlieue in French. It's a French word for suburbs, the areas around the big cities where many of the public housing projects are located. Those areas became known for being areas of high unemployment and also ultimately high criminality as well. And so to French people who tend to pay high taxes to maintain a pretty expensive welfare system, that adds another layer of tensions. Why am I paying taxes? So that I can support some descendant of immigrants who is unemployed in projects. You can see how this would lead to some tensions there. This was reflected in the political sector by the rise of a party called the National Front, the Front National. The leader is, or was, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who himself was a veteran of the war in Algeria. In fact, there have been rumors floating around for years that he might have been involved in some of the exactions like torture that the French army committed during the war in Algeria. This has never been decisively proven. But anyway, he had a very strong anti-immigrant, anti-Algerian platform that resonated with a part of the French public in that his party started from 5% of the vote to 10%, 15%, and now somewhere around 20% of the vote. To the point where in a French political system where you have quite a few parties and few of them have more than 20% of the vote, the party was able to make it to the runoff of the presidential election in 2002. And then again, when his daughter, Marine Le Pen, took over the party, she also made the runoff. So that's an indication that there is a problem with integration of France, with a large Muslim population amounting to about 10% of the population that suffers from higher rates of poverty, but also criminality. That problem, which was already underlying, got even worse in the 1990s when a civil war broke out in Algeria. This began when a popular election resulted in the election of a Muslim fundamentalist party, and the army in Algeria refusing to have Algeria turn into kind of a second Iran or second Saudi Arabia, staged a coup, and then you had a military dictatorship for the rest of the 1990s in Algeria. That led to a civil war between the military dictatorship and the supporters of the Muslim fundamentalist party, but that spilled over into France as well, because in France, the French government supported the military dictatorship from Algeria. And so some of the terrorist attacks aimed at the military dictatorship in Algeria would be committed as well in France. I happened to be a student in Paris during that time, and I remember in 1995 there was a wave of terrorist attacks in the Parisian metro, including at the Saint-Michel metro station. So that would further embitter the relationship between French and Algerian, because as a French person in Paris, you start looking at every Arab man in the metro as a potential terrorist. Obviously 99.9% of them are not terrorists, but that's kind of the general feeling of the population, which would lead on the part of the Arab minority in France to a sentiment of insecurity and being targeted, and there is some discrimination against Arabs in France on racial grounds. So things don't get better. 1999, another important terrorist attack where an Air France flight from Algiers to Paris was hijacked by a member of the GIA, the terrorist group in Algeria. And the idea was to crash that airplane into the Eiffel Tower to make a big statement. That was the original template for the 9/11 attacks. So thankfully, the pilots in the 1999 case were able to claim that they didn't have enough fuel. They landed in Marseille, and then the French SWAT teams boarded the airplane, killed the terrorists, and kind of saved the day. If you're interested in that episode, there's a good movie called L'Assaut, which is about that rescue operation. If you're interested in another movie that is about the Algerian War of the 1990s, there's a famous movie called Des Dieux et des Hommes, which I don't particularly care for. It's kind of long and boring, but won a lot of prizes, so I thought I would mention it. It's about a real-life story of some French Catholic monks that were in Algeria during that time and, well, spoiler alert, got killed in the real life. Another movie from the 1990s that is also very good is called La Haine, Hatred. And this one is set in the ghetto, the projects in the suburbs of Paris. And you can really see the interaction between the population in France of old stock, those that are nicknamed in France as les Gaulois, the Gauls, the Celtic people that have been there since 2,000 years ago, and the more population of Arab descent, who in French slang are called the Beurs, the Arab. That problem with terrorism just kept on going. There was also a case in the 2000s where one French satirical newspaper, Charlie Hebdo, published some cartoons that were seen as offensive to the Prophet Muhammad, and that led to a terrorist attack against the headquarters of that newspaper. And so you have two traditions that clash. One that's based on a strict interpretation of Islam, and another coming from the French Revolution that is about respect for the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press. Another terrible terrorist attack targeting the Stade de France, the French soccer stadium, and then the same day the Bataclan, which was a music hall in Paris. You may notice with the illustration that I'm not showing too much, and you might wonder, well, how big are these terrorist attacks? Is it just a little something? No, this was big. Over 100 people were shot. I'm just trying not to publicize those operations too much. There are some graphic pictures of what went on inside the music hall. I'm not going to show that. We know who the terrorists were. I'm not going to show their picture or tell their names, out of respect for the victim and in order not to make the terrorists into some sort of heroes. Then there was another major terrorist attack the year after that on Bastille Day, when all the French people were out celebrating the fireworks in Nice on the French Riviera. So that creates some problem in France where you realize it's not just a failure of integration. At that point, people are not just unhappy with being unemployed or committing some petty crimes involving drugs and stuff. It's actually waging a war against a country where you were born, because these are second, third generation immigrants. They're not immigrants, they're French nationals born in France. So it's a sign that the country is really at war with itself. In a way, it's a direct consequence of the Algerian War of Independence in the 50s. In a way, we're still divided over that. So where does soccer fit into all of that? You promised me some soccer, or football, as we call it in France, le foot. Well, there's a connection, because soccer is not just a sport. There's something very political about it. In a way, it's the closest thing to war that we have in modern society. When you have a game like the game between England and Argentina in the 1986 World Cup, it's not just England against Argentina. It's a repeat of the Falklands War that pitted those two countries 3 years before, and now Argentina had lost the first war, the real war, and they're going to take the revenge on the pitch through soccer. And they did. Diego Maradona scored the single most beautiful goal ever scored in the World Cup. And also the ugliest, cheatingest goal ever scored in the World Cup. The French national team traditionally had not been the best in the world, did not even qualify for the 90 World Cup, nor for the 94 World Cup. But in 98 we did qualify because the tournament was hosted by France. So when you host a tournament, by default, you are in the tournament. The team that year was a combination of players from diverse backgrounds. Some of them would be Gaulois, a white Frenchman of old stock, but also you also had people called les Blacks, which is a French slang term for black people from sub-Saharan Africa, and then Beurs, the people of Arab descent. And some politicians, including Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, would criticize the team for being a bit too brown, a bit too black, a bit too Arab, and so not too good. And it was not too good for many years. Except in the 98 World Cup, they did much better than expected. Somehow the team always won and ended up in the final, facing Brazil, which is the superstar of the World Cup every time. And as a French soccer fan, which a lot of French boys are, when you play soccer at recess, the game that you always play in your make-believe world is let's pretend this is France against Brazil in the final of the World Cup. And there it was, for real. And France did not lose to Brazil as expected, but won in a decisive fashion. This was not a squeaker. 1, 2, and eventually 3-0 against Brazil. The big star of that World Cup was Zinedine Zidane. Why is he important? Because he was born in Marseille, that's city in the south of France where you had a large immigration population, and his parents were Algerian immigrants. They were Kabyle from North Algeria. And he scored 2 beautiful headers in the final and pretty much helped France win the World Cup that year. And so he would become a symbol of successful integration at a time when a lot of French people were wondering, is it working? Is that multicultural society in France failing in some way? He would be the counterpoint. On one side, you have the terrorist attacks of, say, 95 in the Parisian metro, and on the other side, Zidane, a successful method of integration. He became a symbol of the successful black blanc beurre France, one that is deriving strength from its diverse immigrant origins. And ever since then, the way the French national team has done has been seen as a symbol of how well French society is doing. 2 years later, in 2000, the French team won the Euro. So everybody thinks, okay, immigration works. Maybe we should all get along. 2 years later, at the World Cup in 2002, the French team does not do at all well. They get kicked out in the first round. So all of a sudden, people say, well, of course, they're all black and they're all immigrants. Of course, we don't do well. Fast forward 4 years later, 2006, Zidane is back in business. He went back from retirement to help the French national team. qualified the French team pretty much on his own to the final round, and then played some magnificent soccer, especially against Brazil in the quarterfinal, and then brought the French team all the way to the final of the World Cup again, and scored a beautiful penalty kick using a Panenka. Italy equalized, so it was 1-1 into overtime. Italy is the major enemy of France traditionally, so you really want to win that one and get that second star on the jersey to signify that you've won 2 World Cups. And then Zidane snaps. He headbutts an Italian player, gets sent out with a red card, and then France lost in a penalty shootout. So after having allowed France to go all the way to the final, Zidane pretty much lost the game for France. Fast forward another 4 years, France plays in the World Cup in 2010 in South Africa. Again, it's a very diverse team, racially speaking. And they did horribly, and I mean horribly. And at some point, one of the team players insults the coach. And instead of apologizing for his behavior, the rest of the team backs him and in fact has a rebellion against the coach or the French nation in general and refuses to get out of the bus and go and train when they're supposed to for the next game. They go on strike, which is pretty common in France, but seems a bit galling when you're wearing the French national jersey and you're being paid millions upon millions of dollars to attend the World Cup. So that created a huge fuss in France, and France actually was kicked out of the World Cup after losing the next game. And again, all this tension resurfaces where people saying that's the reason why we don't have a good national soccer team. It's because these people from immigration, from the projects, are scum. They don't have any respect for law and order, or they're not really patriotic. Based on the color of their skin, they cannot be proper Frenchmen. France tried to organize a game between France and Algeria, the soccer team. In that case, it's not the World Cup, it's more of a friendly. As it happened, France and Algeria had never met each other on the pitch since independence. Algeria is in Africa, France in Europe, so they were in different qualifying rounds and they never bumped into each other before. So the idea, let's organize a game in Paris, and this way it will be a sign of reconciliation. It's about 40, 50 years after the War of Independence. And now let's use soccer as a way to mend French society and French diplomacy with Algeria. The game didn't start too well. You had a lot of people in the stands, and most of them were born in France, but they were usually immigrants or descendants of immigrants. And instead of waving the French flag, they're waving the Algerian flag. The national anthems are played, the Marseillaise, the French anthem, is booed. People get very upset about that. And when the game starts, France plays pretty well, including Zinedine Zidane, the star French player, the symbol of successful integration. But in the stands, things are not doing so well, and people start going on the pitch, and more people. Next thing you know, mayhem ensues, and the game had to be stopped. Because apparently, even 40, 50 years after the end of the War of Independence, France and Algeria don't get along enough to simply play a single soccer game that is a friendly game. So whatever point was trying to be made by the organizers of that friendly game, the exact opposite happened. It became a symbol of how bitter the relationship between France and Algeria still is to the present time. Just to end on a positive note, in 2018, France did do pretty well at the World Cup, and with another multi-racial, multi-ethnic team, made it all the way to the final and beat Croatia 4-2. So you see how soccer is kind of a representation of the long, divisive relationship between France and Algeria since 1962. That's all I have to say about that conflict. We'll stop here, and I'll see you next time.